Hi, I'm Linda Sparks. I'm the owner of Farthingale's Corset Making Supplies. I'm the author of the book, The Basics of Corset Making, and I taught a craftsy class called Custom Corsets, Bones, Casings, and Busks. And today I'm going to talk about how to manipulate and work with the pattern that I used in that class, and that is now available as download on the Farthingale's website. The corset pattern I'll be using is a basic 4-panel corset pattern, which means there's 4 pieces per side. Now if you can see this is the front, and we need to add a piece, and that piece is included in the printout toward the back. So we're going to have to cut these 2 pieces, the front and the back, and attach them to the top part. We have the front, we have the side front, we have the back, side back, and the back. So I'm just going to cut these ones, and you can actually see here it says attach to waist cincher back 1 at the line. So I'm just going to cut that. And always keep your paper on the table and your scissors on the table. It helps you cut more accurately. And that will go to there. And I'm just going to tape that. So the tape that I like to use is the matte tape. It's called invisible tape. And if you're unsure, you might want to use magic tape so you can reposition it. But I've just lined up all of my lines, and the back is now done. And I'm going to cut my front. And again, I'm just lining up my lines. Taping those together. Now on the smaller sizes you won't need to tape it, because the smaller sizes this whole pattern piece fits on 1 piece of paper, and on the larger section, one of the larger sizes, you'll need to tape even these pieces together. So it depends on which size you've downloaded. And the pattern comes in 3 sizes, 3 size ranges, so that we cover size 18 through 46. I'm just going to put that aside. I've now taped my pieces together, and you'll notice there's a square on each page. So that square indicates the measurement that your print should be. And if you follow the instruction on the website or in the pattern instructions, this should measure 1 inch. And you can see from there to there it says this square should measure 1 inch, and it does. So therefore, I know that this pattern is to the proportion that it's supposed to be. The lines along the side are indicating size lines. So you can see it says 28, 30, 32, 34, and 36. A size 28 will fit a body with a 32-inch waist. So what you want is this number to be 4 inches smaller than your actual waist. And that's how you'll order the pattern. You want to make sure that you're in the right size range. So we have the square where you're going to measure to make sure that the proportion is right. You're going to have the various size lines, and there's other information on these patterns that you want to look at. Now I've decided that for my demonstration, I'm going to use the size 28. So I'm taking a highlighter and I'm highlighting the size 28 line. And I'm going to do that on each one of these patterns. And I'm doing that so that there's no way I get confused or accidentally cut or use the wrong line, especially if I'm getting interrupted. So each one of these is going to be marked. And really, it doesn't take very long, and it's hugely advantageous because it means you don't accidentally use the wrong line. And if you do use the wrong line, it's sometimes very hard to tell until you get the product made up. So if you notice, this is the back, and this is the side back seam that I've marked. There is no marking there because we're automatically going to cut along that line. Take these back. So there we are. I have it marked, my 1-inch line, and I'm ready to add my seam allowance because as it says right here, no seam allowance. So I'm taking my see-through ruler, and this is a see-through ruler. And what's important to note is that there are 8 little squares to an inch, and then there'll be 8 on that side. Some rulers have 10 of these little squares, so it can get really confusing and it can throw off your measuring. This has 8, and each one of those indicate 1/8 of an inch. This is our center front line. It's labeled. This is our seam allowance for the center front line. So we don't need to do anything to the center front line, but we do need to add seam allowance to our side seams. And I want to use a 1-inch seam allowance. And I do this because it allows me room to alter. So I'm just lining up the 1-inch mark along the seam line for the size 28 that I've highlighted. And I've used that line. Just making a lot of noise here. And then I'm taking a French curve, which is also known as a variform curve. And I'm making sure that I'm lining it up with my short lines. You may have to shift it a little so that that is a complete line. And then I'm taking my see-through ruler and I'm following from point to point to add the notch. So I'm lining my ruler up throughout the center point of all of these triangles in order to create a notch. And at this point, at the top, I just want to close that off. And I'm closing that off. So this becomes our cut line. And I'm just going to do a couple little scissors there. So that's our cut line, and this is our sew line. And I've done 1-inch seam allowance because that allows me to alter the pattern once it's made up. So I cut it out of fabric, put it on the body, and that 1-inch seam allowance gives me room to let the corset out. So you may have broader hips than this pattern or a larger rib cage. This allows you room to fit by using a 1-inch seam allowance. If you prefer to use a smaller seam allowance, let's say you want a 1/2-inch seam allowance, you're just lining up that 1/2-inch mark and drawing the lines on. So there's the front ready to go. And that's an easy one because the lines are straight. So I'm going to go on to the next one. I think I'll use the side front piece because it's curvier. So it's a little bit more difficult to do. And as you can see, I do have room to add 1-inch seam allowance here on this paper. You might find, if you're using one of the larger sizes, that you have to tape another piece of paper onto the side. And that's okay. The other thing that you can do is you can use a glue stick and paste each one of these onto poster board. And you can get poster board from the dollar store. I'm just going to line that up so that I'm following that line straight. And this is another form of variform. So the kind that you have doesn't really matter. You're just going to want to make sure that you're lining up the curves so that they meet. And then I have to turn it the other way. So if you're posting this to poster board, pasting this to poster board, You get the poster board from the dollar store, paste it on so there's lots of room on either side of the page, and then you can add the 1-inch seam allowance to the larger sizes. I'm just going to do this one. And as you can see that by highlighting the line, I know exactly where I'm aligning my ruler. There's no guesswork. I'm just following that line straight, and that line straight. And if it's not exact at the top and bottom, it's really not a big problem because you're going to be doing alterations to the pattern anyway, once you have it on the body. So it's not a quick process, but it is an important one. And then again, I'm lining this up with my waistline mark so that the notches are in the right place. I'm lining it up with the center of each one of those notches. So there's a curved one and there's the straight one. And you can see where those will fit together. And again, I'll just put little scissors there. So you know that's the cut line, and the highlighted line is the sewing line. So later, when you're working with this pattern, you know exactly where your seam was. You know which seam you used. There's no question about what size you used. It's right there. So that's how you will mark all of your pieces on the side seams. So on the seams that are graded where there's various sizes. And again, back to the center back and the center front, we don't do anything to those because the seam allowance is already in the pattern for you. Just before we move on, I'm going to show you what I would end up with when I pasted the pattern to poster board. So it's much more solid, and you can see that I needed to add my seam allowance beyond the edge of the paper, so that's the poster board that's showing through, and then I've used a pattern notcher to notch it. And this really makes tracing your pattern onto fabric really easy. I just put the poster board down with the pattern on it. I can hold it down with my hand and I trace around directly on the fabric. So I'm not actually pinning the pieces to the fabric, which you traditionally do with a tissue pattern. And there again, you can see I had to go beyond the edge of the paper as I did there, and that's the poster board that's showing through. And the same with down here. So sometimes you may want to add it to poster board in order to give it more stability or to add to the size. But to add to the size, you can also just tape 2 pieces of paper together. So I'm just going to put that aside and I'll get back to measuring for bones and measuring for the bust. So we've added the seam allowance to all of our pieces. You may have noticed that we didn't add seam allowance to the top or to the bottom, and we don't have to. That's automatically incorporated into this pattern, and you bind the top and bottom edges anyway, so it's not like you're creating additional length. So I'm going to show you how to measure for the busk. I typically use a 1/2 inch seam allowance at the top of my corsets. There's the phone ring. And at the bottom. Now you may choose to use a different seam allowance, and that depends on the binding, the width of the binding that you like at the top and bottom. I just, 1/2 inch is what I always pretty much use. So I've marked the 1/2 inch at the top and the bottom. Now on this particular pattern, if you may be able to see, 9-inch busk is written on the center front. But if you're using someone else's pattern, that may not be indicated. I'm now going 1/4 inch from the center front So the 1/4 inch mark is on that center front line. And I can see that that is just shy of 9 inches. Now I'm going 1/4 inch from the front because the busk will be 1/2 inch wide, or at least they're usually 1/2 inch wide. And the longest part of the busk is in the middle of the busk. So the longest part is 1/4 inch in from the edge. So it's the middle of the busk. And I can see that that's just ever so slightly longer than 9 inches. So that's a 9-inch busk is what this corset pattern is going to take. It is written on the front, but again, some patterns that you work with won't be, so it's important to know how to measure. Now I'm going to show you how to measure for bone lengths. When measuring for bone lengths, you first have to determine where you want to put your bones. In this pattern, I'm going to put them on every seam, and I'm going to put one in the middle of each panel. I'm also going to put one beside the busk. So that's where I'm going to start. Means I'm just going to extend my 1/2 inch mark a little bit. So there's my 1/2 inch away, which is sort of the edge of where my busk will be. And if I've got a 1/4 inch bone, then I need to be at about a little bit more than 1/8. And I'm getting some glare on my ruler, so that's a little difficult to see. So I can see that it's 8 5/8. But if I'm using a spring steel bone, I'll need to know in centimeters what that is. And I can always work that out a little bit later. Typically that would make, from this measurement, it's 8 5/8, and I want my bone to be at least 1/8, if not 1/4 inch, shorter than that length, shorter than the length of the casing. And I want that so that the bone can move up and down within the casing when you're wearing it. And that will keep you from getting holes at the top or holes at the bottom where the bone has worn through your corset as it rubs. So we've measured our busk and we've measured for the bone next to the busk. Now with this pattern, all of the seam allowances, with the exception of the back one, are pressed toward the back of the corset. So I'm not going to measure this line for my corset bone. I'm going to measure the length of the seam that attaches to this. So I'm going to go to my side front pattern piece in order to determine that bone length. So this is my side front. Because my seam allowances are pressed toward the back, my bone will rest right along here. It will rest right along this seam line within the seam allowance. So again, I want to mark the 1/2 inch line for my top and bottom casings. And then I can measure this way. And I'm actually just sort of following that curve. And I'm getting that this is about 6 3/8. So that will be a 6-inch bone. Because boning comes in 1/2 inch increments, and a 6 1/2 would be too long. So I'm scaling it back to a 6-inch bone. And that will be a spiral bone in order to accommodate this curve so well. If I decide that I want a bone in the middle of the panel, so this is one panel of the corset, the easiest way to do this is to just measure so that I'm seeing where the halfway point is. And I can either measure from seam to seam or from cut line to cut line. So this happens to be 3 3/4. So I want it to be 1 6/8. And then I do the same thing here. And there's my line. And if I'm having a 1/4 inch bone, I can just put a little mark up here and a little mark up here. I'm going to want at least a 3/8 inch casing. So I'm just lining the 3/8 inch mark, or 3/16 I suppose. And there's one line, and then I create 3/8 of an inch from that. So that's basically where my next bone is going to go. Now you can also determine this when you do the fitting. So if you put the corset on someone, you may see where you need to put that boning. It's much more important in larger bodies than in smaller bodies. So I've measured one of my bone casings here. I've shown you how to mark the 1/2 inch above and below the cut lines of the top edge. I've measured that, and then I've rounded down to the nearest 1/2 inch, and then I've created a bone in the middle, and I'm doing the same thing. 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch, and then I just need to measure that. And that's right on 6.5. So whatever that turns out to be in centimeters, I will round it down so that it ends up being 6.25, equivalent of 6.25, because I want that bone to be shorter than the bone casing. Otherwise, when you go to put your top binding on, you'll be putting your bottom binding on first. When you go to put your top binding on, you can't sew past that because the foot of your sewing machine is going to bang into that bone. So you want it to be shorter than that in order to make it easy to put the binding on, and you also want it to have room to move up and down when you're wearing the corset. So we've added seam allowance, we've measured for the busk, and we've measured for bones. And that is about it for today. I'm going to assume that you might want to change the length or shape of the bottom or top edge of your corset. I strongly suggest that you make a mock-up of this pattern exactly as it is first before you do that. But if you decide that you want to change the design line of the bottom or top of the corset, I'm going to show you how to do that. So I have my front and I have my side front. And I'm just going to leave my front the same so that I keep the same busk length, but I'm going to change the shape of my side piece. So let's assume I want to add 1 inch in length to the bottom. I'm going to line up my inch line, and I'm going to then reshape this. Now again, I'm leaving the front as it is, so that means this is going to become a more dramatic curve. So I can take my seam, my French curve or my vary form, and I can reshape it. And I'm just winging this. And I'm going to continue that 1 inch out the side so that I've got a little bit more hip coverage. This can take a bit of playing with. So you can see where it meets the front has not changed. That's still the same. So I don't need to change my front, but I will need to change my side back piece. So I'm going to take my front away and bring my side back. So now you can see that we need to add, and obviously I haven't added the seam allowances to that one, so I'll just do that first. And again, because I've highlighted that line, I don't really have to think too much about it. And I'm following that edge straight up. And if you want, you can actually fold this along the seam line and put the seam line right along here. And then you can see where that needs to come to. And I'm going to use this, and we're not going to change the center back either. So we now have our new side back and our new side front. And by putting these seams together, you can see how that's going to look. So again, you're going to want to make a mock-up so that you put this on the body and see that those curves are where you want them to be. And you can treat the top exactly the same way. You might want the top to rise up at the side to give you a little bit more coverage up the side of the corset. You can actually do whatever you want. Just make sure that you make a mock-up and try the mock-up on to confirm that those curves are where you want them to be and that they're fitting the body the way you want it to fit the body. So really, altering a corset pattern is pretty straightforward and simple. You just have to get in there and play with it. I hope you've enjoyed this video and that you'll download our pattern if you haven't already. I'm Linda Sparks, and I hope you've learned something from this video today and will consider viewing some of the other videos that we're doing. I'm the owner of Farthingales here in Stratford, Ontario, Canada. We're an online store for corset making supplies, so you can find anything that we've used today on our website, and that's www.farthingales.corsetmakingsupplies.com. You can also find our product at Vogue Fabrics in Evanston, Illinois, and they also have a website, voguefabricsstore.com. So again, I hope you've enjoyed the video, I hope you've learned something, and I hope that you'll check in again. Thanks for watching.